Hey guys, tonight we begin with something tender, something medieval, and something that smells faintly of onions and goat. That's right, we're diving into the world of medieval dating. Picture this. You wake up in the year 1348. Birds are chirping, the village bell tolls in the distance, and the gentle aroma of manure wafts through your windowless hut. Your heart flutters, not from plague this time, but because you saw someone across the barley fields yesterday, and wow, their linen head wrap was barely singed from last week's fire. True beauty. You live in a world with no texting, no dating apps, and definitely no casual meet-cutes at coffee shops. The closest you'll get is maybe making eye contact at the communal bread oven, while covered in flour and regret. And even that might be too forward. Medieval romance is awkward, indirect, and chock full of unwashed charm. It's less, will you go out with me? And more, do your parents need another plow mule? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your morning begins with the usual scratch and sniff routine. Scratch your lice, sniff your armpits, and try to determine whether today's aroma leans more rancid goat or swampy burlap. Hygiene isn't really a thing, but it does play a surprisingly big role in dating. You see, in a world without perfume counters, you do your best with crushed herbs, chewed mint, and, in some cases, a garland of onions. Historians still debate whether this was a health tactic or just a desperate hope no one would notice the other smells. You throw on your best tunic. It's the same one you wear every day, but you brushed off the dried mud and maybe picked off a beetle or two. You've got places to be, specifically the well. That's where all the interesting people linger. Not because they love hydrating, but because it's one of the few communal spaces where chatting is allowed. Especially if a chaperone is nearby pretending not to eavesdrop. Crushing on someone in medieval times is exhausting. You can't just walk up and say hello. Oh no, you need layers. Literal layers of approval. Family, parish priest, local lord, and sometimes even the community goose lady, who seems to know everyone's business. Romantic interest is filtered through social rank, wealth, livestock holdings, and how many teeth you still have. And if you're missing a few, best to keep that mouth shut and smile with your eyes. Still, you find ways to catch attention. Maybe you work the same field. Maybe you share a breadline. Maybe you both step in the same puddle of cow waste and laugh because, really, what are the odds? Eye contact is brief but electric. A glance too long could spark rumors. And in medieval villages, gossip spreads faster than the Black Death. Literally. If you're lucky, your interest is mutual. You might hear a small compliment passed along through 3 cousins and a neighbor's child. He thinks you have strong ankles, she says with a wink. Swoon. That's high praise. Ankles meant good walking stamina, and good walking stamina meant you could carry water, grain, or the future of a household. Clothing matters too. A well-kept cloak, preferably without visible rat holes, suggests stability. If you're wearing shoes, actual shoes with laces, that's a sign you either have money or know someone with a strong leather trade. Either way, it's attractive. Historians still argue whether colorful garments were considered flirtatious or simply suspicious. But one thing is certain. Bright green hose got attention, mostly because they were rare and likely stolen. Music is another way to woo. If you're lucky enough to play the lute, or even a poorly strung harp, you might draw a crowd at the tavern. Just don't sing too well, or people might think you've made a pact with the devil. Yes, that was a real concern. People who were too talented at anything, dancing, singing, bread baking, risked suspicion. That said, a clumsy love song about your crush's elbows? Perfectly safe. And then there's the all-important matter of teeth. If you have most of yours and they don't wobble too much, you're in the top tier. Dental care was non-existent, and sugar hadn't yet arrived in buckets, so decay was a slow and painful process. Courtship often included a careful look at each other's mouths, usually during feasts when someone laughed too hard and revealed the damage. Nothing says future spouse like shared dental misfortune. Maybe you impress them with your knowledge of farming, or the fact that you own 2 goats. Or maybe, just maybe, you helped their cousin build a fence last spring and didn't complain once when you got splinters. Romance in the Middle Ages wasn't flashy. It was about endurance, familiarity, and not dying before the next harvest. Eventually, you build up the courage to speak. It's brief, awkward, maybe just a nod and a muttered, "Weather's nice," while you both stand ankle-deep in mud. But in this world, that's practically a declaration of love. You walk away heart-pounding, sheep bleating in the background, wondering if they'll smile at you tomorrow, or if you'll be married off to someone 3 villages over by next Tuesday. Because here's the thing about medieval dating. You never really know if it's going somewhere. Time moves differently. Life is short, and marriage often comes without much warning. One day you're stealing glances over shared porridge. The next, you're sitting at a table negotiating how many hens your hand is worth. But today, for now, you've made eye contact. You smiled. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough to warm your heart for one more flea-ridden, mud-caked, romantically tragic day in 14th century Europe. You trudge into the village square the next morning, cloak slightly less damp than usual, and hair attempting something vaguely presentable. Today's goal? Casual proximity. Because in medieval times, flirting wasn't loud or flashy. It was mostly just standing near someone while pretending to be interested in turnips. The marketplace is alive with the clatter of wooden carts, the bleating of sheep, and the ever-present squish of mud beneath every footstep. It smells like smoked fish, stale beer, and ambition. This is where people mingle. Peasants bartering over onions, traveling monks whispering sermons, and hopeful romantics trying to catch someone's eye while pretending they're very interested in root vegetables. If you're looking for love, this is your scene. It's not just about buying things. It's about being seen buying things. "Oh, I didn't realize you were here," you say, standing directly behind the person you've been pretending not to follow for 3 blocks. Casual. Totally natural. But don't be too obvious. Public displays of affection are practically illegal, not by statute, but by custom and scandal. A well-timed glance is the gold standard of courtship. A smile is daring. An actual touch, that's marriage proposal territory. Your fingers accidentally brush while reaching for the same cabbage, and suddenly, everyone assumes you're betrothed by sunset. And then there's the livestock. Yes, dating and livestock are often intertwined. You might be here because you're coincidentally both shopping for chickens, or because your families are jointly investing in a pig. Romantic? No. But in the 14th century, livestock were the social glue. If you were coordinating goat schedules, there was probably a spark. This is also the time for subtle compliments. "That's a fine hat" doesn't mean they like your hat. It means they like your face under it. And if they mention your sturdy boots, Be still your heart. That's basically, you're attractive and I trust you not to slip in manure. True medieval chemistry. Now, not everyone's lucky enough to be free to mingle. Many young women, and even some young men, are watched like hawks. Enter the chaperone. She might be a mother, an aunt, a servant, or just a very determined older sister. Her job? To ensure nothing scandalous happens. Her skill? Making awkward silence 10 times more awkward by hovering. You learn to flirt under observation. It becomes an art form, conveying longing through bread prices. Did you hear wheat's gone up again? You ask, eyes intense. So tragic, they reply, cheeks flushed. The subtext? You like each other. But the chaperone only hears economic concern. Mission accomplished. Of course, not every market flirtation ends well. Sometimes someone flirts back, too hard. A wink turns into an offer to meet behind the tannery. And now you're being followed by someone who smells like old vinegar and misjudged confidence. You quickly pivot, joining a cluster of nuns passing by and pretending to discuss penance. It's the medieval version of a social escape hatch. Occasionally, someone gets bold and tries to pass a note. Not a modern, folded paper love letter. More like a scrap of parchment with slightly smeared ink, probably written by a third party. Literacy rates were low, so if you couldn't write, you'd hire someone who could. Usually a monk, a clerk, or that guy who hangs around the scribe's stall offering romantic dictation services for a boiled egg. But even the simplest note is a big risk. If it's intercepted, it could trigger anything from gossip to forced marriage. Or worse, someone's uncle might challenge someone else's uncle to a duel, which always ends with someone falling into a pig pen. So, why go through all this trouble? Because when you live in a world where your future is mostly about surviving the next winter, falling in love, or even pretending to, feels like rebellion, like joy, like defiance in the face of plague, poverty, and chronic foot rot. And some people go all in. They show up every market day wearing their best tunic. They offer their intended the choicest apple. They casually mention their family owns 3 whole chickens and a cart with only 1 wheel missing. These are the grand romantic gestures of the time. Forget roses. Bring her a non-cracked pottery bowl, and she might swoon. There are also the gossipers. They hang around the stalls like bored historians, collecting romantic rumors like they're rare coins. "Did you see Thomas and Eleanor near the barley sacks?" they whisper. "He said her apron was symmetrical." Scandalous. Next thing you know, everyone's talking about it, including the priest. Speaking of priests, they're not immune to the courtship shuffle either. Technically, they're supposed to stay out of it, but that never stops them from having very strong opinions about who should marry whom. "That boy seems devout," he says, watching your crush light a candle. "You should speak with his mother, quietly." Some priests even act as go-betweens. They arrange meetings, pass messages, and offer moral commentary along the way. "She's a fine girl," they say, "but beware her cousin. He fights geese for sport." By late afternoon, the market begins to empty. People head back to their huts, wagons creaking under the weight of goods and hopes. You linger just a bit longer, pretending to inspect the leeks, hoping for one more glance, one more brief smile. And when it comes, it's like a warm breeze in a cold chapel. As you walk home, feet squelching in muck, heart floating somewhere above your linen collar, you realize something important. Today wasn't about bartering. It wasn't about chickens or chaperones or suspicious apples. It was about feeling alive. In a world where so much is out of your control, where love is rationed like firewood and gossip is currency, Moments like this matter, and if tomorrow brings another trip to the market, you'll be ready, with better breath maybe, and a plan to complement their turnips. The next few days, you try not to seem too eager. But let's be honest, you're always at the well a little earlier, always happen to be near the baker when they are, and your firewood gathering route now includes a completely unnecessary loop past their family's goat shed. Casual. But no matter how subtle you think you're being, medieval villages are the original surveillance states. Everyone sees everything, especially the women. Old women, aunties, widows, midwives. Women who know exactly what you're doing, because they did it themselves half a lifetime ago. They exchange knowing glances. They whisper. They start referring to you with phrases like, the hopeful one, and that girl who keeps brushing her hair for no reason. Here's where things get real. The chaperones. You see, no respectable person goes about unaccompanied. If you're a young woman of marrying age, someone is always watching. An older relative, a family servant, sometimes even your little brother. Because nothing kills romance quite like a 9-year-old loudly asking if you plan to marry the man you just said hello to. In some noble households, it's even stricter. Young ladies are kept indoors, embroidering with the speed of nervous energy, practicing music on instruments they don't enjoy, and peeking out windows like caged birds with very ambitious crushes. Meanwhile, their chaperones, usually someone named Lady Agnes or Dame something, sit nearby with one good eye on the sewing and the other on the door. And then there's scent. Oh, the scent. You think medieval dating is about love and compatibility? Try navigating romance when everyone smells like they've been in a sack of onions for a week. Hygiene is a luxury few can afford. Bathing is rare, water is often cold or deadly, and soap, well, it's expensive and mostly made for rich folks and monks with a cleanliness compulsion. So people improvise. Garlic garlands to mask breath, sprigs of rosemary tucked into clothing, goose fat mixed with crushed rose petals if you're feeling fancy. Some folks even believe that if you rub yourself with lavender and hang upside down for a few minutes, the scent will sink in through your pores. Historians still argue whether that was genuine belief or just very early aromatherapy fraud. Clothing plays a part too. Peasants wear rough wool and linen, layers meant to trap heat. Unfortunately, also trapping odor. If you see someone in clean clothing, take note. That probably means they did laundry recently, which, in medieval terms, is a major act of devotion. You don't wash your tunic for fun. You do it for love. Among the wealthier classes, there's a bit more style. Gowns, head coverings, brocade if you're rich, velvet if you're trying too hard. Gentlemen might wear hose so tight they're basically making a fashion statement and a fertility boast at the same time. Ribbons are tied into hair. Gloves are perfumed. One noble reportedly wore lemon-scented gloves so aggressively he made everyone at court sneeze. Romance, in his mind, smelled like citrus and mild allergy. Then come the social games. You're not allowed to just say you like someone. That's too forward. Instead, you participate in polite society rituals, which are essentially structured flirtathons. You dance at feast days, but only with permission. You recite poetry, but never admit you wrote it. You compliment their embroidery while simultaneously trying to decode whether their stitch pattern includes a secret message about wanting to meet behind the barn at dusk. Conversations are veiled. Instead of saying, I like you, you say, your family's barley crop is strong this year. Instead of, I want to hold your hand, you say, may I escort you across this puddle. It's emotionally exhausting and also a little bit adorable. like watching two shy hedgehogs try to high-five without rolling into balls. And heaven forbid someone actually flirts. Flirting, real flirting, is dangerous. It means someone might get ideas. And ideas, in medieval villages, are how scandals are born. If you're too charming, people talk. If you're too shy, people talk. If you make eye contact while smiling and someone's aunt sees it, congratulations, you're now that flirt who probably stirs potions under the full moon. Sometimes the gossip is helpful. It can nudge parents to arrange a meeting, or it might bring the local priest into the mix. But other times it's malicious. Someone's jealous or bored, or just feeling particularly dramatic after 3 days of bad pottage and no rain. They say you've been acting improper. Maybe you lingered too long at the bread stall. Maybe you smiled while eating berries. Either way, it's enough to trigger a whisper chain that ends with you being sent to stay with your cousin 3 villages over until things calm down. If you're noble, your reputation is everything. One misstep, one rumor, and you're no longer a future bride. You're a liability. Noble families guard their daughter's virtue like it's actual currency, because it sort of is. A daughter's chastity directly impacts the political power of marriage. A scandal can mean broken alliances, angry dowry negotiations, and the awkward cancellation of a betrothal via raven. Peasant families, on the other hand, are slightly more relaxed, not because they're liberal, but because life is harder and there's less at stake. If the girl likes the boy, and the boy's family has decent land or a working ox, romance is allowed a bit more room to breathe, just not unsupervised breathing. Still, no matter your status, every relationship is shadowed by 2 things: gossip and guardians. There's no private texting, no disappearing messages, no lockable diaries. Everything you do is public, shared, and subject to interpretation. That look you gave at the well? Recorded. That joke you whispered at the sheep fair? Transcribed by 3 passing widows. That hand brush? Passed along at supper until it becomes a scandalous caress behind the alehouse. But somehow, through all this surveillance and smell and social peril, people still fall in love. They find ways to be near each other, to speak in code, to exchange meaningful glances over moldy cheese. They sneak moments behind barns, under trees, or even in the chapel during candle-snuffing duties. Where there's a will and a haystack, there's a way. So you keep going. You nod politely. You pass along small gifts, a better apple, a dried flower, a half-smooth stone that maybe once belonged to a saint. You endure the chaperones and the whispers and the perfume experiments gone wrong. Because in the medieval world, love isn't just a feeling. It's a slow, cautious, cabbage-scented victory over every obstacle in your path. Eventually, after days, maybe weeks, of carefully timed well encounters, subtle glances across pig pens, and a few heart-pounding shared silences near the barley field, the moment arrives. The message is delivered. Not by you, of course. That would be outrageous. No, it's passed via someone's cousin's godfather's niece, who happens to be walking that way. And what does it say? A love letter. Well, sort of. Let's be clear. Most people in medieval Europe couldn't read, let alone write poetry. So if you're hoping to declare your undying love in eloquent verse, you're going to need help. Enter the medieval ghostwriter, a local monk, clerk, or sometimes the one guy in the village who knows Latin and has suspiciously strong opinions about rhyming schemes. You sit beside the scribe, describing your feelings. She has nice, hands, you mumble, fidgeting with your tunic. The scribe nods gravely. Shall we say her fingers are like slender branches reaching toward the heavens? You blink. Sure, that sounds romantic, and a bit like a tree, but go on. He scratches away with his quill, dipping it into ink made from oak galls and iron salts. Inky, clumpy stuff that stains fingers for days. He writes in uneven script, carefully avoiding flourishes that might be mistaken for pride. This isn't an illuminated manuscript. It's love on a budget. Eventually, the letter is finished. A carefully folded square of parchment, sealed with wax if you're fancy, or tied with a bit of twine if you're not. You hand it off, heart racing, to a reliable go-between, usually a younger sibling who can be bribed with pie crust or the promise of not tattling next time you skip evening prayers. She receives it. Maybe she giggles. Maybe she blushes. Maybe she frowns because your scribe accidentally wrote, "Your nose shines like a blessed turnip," which was meant to be flattering. Still, it's a gesture, and gestures are everything. In a world without constant communication, even a clumsy message feels like thunder. Sometimes she writes back, if she can. If not, she finds her own proxy, a lady's maid with a sharp tongue, or a friend from Weaving Circle who once had a secret lover and knows how to fold notes so they look like laundry receipts. The letter she sends might be simple, just a line. The moon was bright tonight. I thought of you. You read it 17 times, convinced it's the most beautiful thing ever written, and frankly, it kind of is. Among nobles, this letter-writing practice becomes elevated, almost theatrical. They hire poets. They send verses wrapped around flowers or hidden inside pastry crusts. Some of these love letters survive today in museum collections, filled with swooning phrases like, "Your beauty pierces my soul like a knight's lance through a tournament dummy." Historians still argue whether that was meant to be romantic or just oddly violent. But peasant love notes, those usually don't survive. They were short, practical, and often burned to avoid being discovered by a parent or priest with very strong feelings about propriety. Yet they mattered. A scribbled note tucked into a basket, a line etched in a beam where only the beloved would see. Love, in all its medieval awkwardness, found a way. Sometimes the letter is recited aloud. You memorize it. You practice in front of your cow. And one day, you manage to say it. Well, most of it, while pretending to talk about oat prices. Your eyes are like, the river, but not the muddy part. They laugh. Not at you, but with you. Which, in the Middle Ages, is practically a proposal. Still, love letters could be dangerous. If intercepted, they could lead to accusations of impropriety. Families might demand explanations. Chaperones would increase their surveillance. The priest might insist on extra confessionals. And the village gossips. Oh, they feast. A misdelivered note could set off weeks of awkward glances and whispered speculation. Did you hear? He wrote that her smile made his heart twitch. Twitch! Can you imagine? And yet, people keep writing. Because even in a world of curfews, curdled milk, and clerical oversight, the heart insists on speaking. Sometimes letters go further. They hint at marriage. They suggest plans. My father says I may inherit the back field by spring. That's romance. That's commitment. And when both families approve, or at least don't object too loudly, things begin to move. But don't be fooled. A letter doesn't mean you're betrothed. There's still a long road between I like you and I do. There are banns to be read, dowries to be negotiated, livestock to be inventoried. But this letter, this wrinkled, ink-stained, chicken-smudged letter is the beginning. Not every love letter is met with joy, of course. Sometimes they're laughed at. Sometimes they're saved for evidence in future disputes. And sometimes they're kept, tucked into a pouch, wrapped in cloth, stored beneath straw mattresses. Because even if the relationship never goes further, the feeling was real. And that piece of parchment carries weight. In castles, these letters are often embroidered into love tokens, phrases stitched into handkerchiefs or banners. One surviving example simply reads, "I see thee in the firelight and ache." Tender, dramatic. Probably written by someone who's never actually done laundry by firelight, but still, a good effort. Among peasants, letters are practical. Meet me after Vespers. Bring your cousin. No poetry, just logistics. And honestly, that kind of directness has its own charm. When you're working 12 hours a day in muddy fields, efficiency matters. So you write. Or you hire someone to write. Or you whisper the words and hope they reach the right ears. Because in medieval times, a love letter isn't just communication. It's rebellion. It's art. It's a tiny, dangerous act of vulnerability in a world that leaves little room for softness. And when the message is received and they smile at you, genuinely, warmly, perhaps even a little mischievously, you realize something wonderful. Your feeling survived translation, parchment, scribal embellishment, delivery, and gossip. If that's not true love, what is? It's nearly spring now, and something shifts in the air, subtle but certain. The days stretch longer, the birds sing louder, and for the first time in months, the mud under your boots starts to feel more like a mild inconvenience than a personal attack. It's the season of change. And in medieval Europe, that means one thing above all else. The feast days are coming. These aren't just random parties. They are the backbone of medieval social life, little bursts of joy and ritual that punctuate the long stretches of labor and suffering. A single feast day, depending on where you live, could celebrate a saint, a harvest, a royal birth, or even just the fact that the village didn't get burned down that year. And if you're of courting age, they're also your best shot at making progress with your crush without drawing the ire of 6 different family members and the entire church. You wake up earlier than usual, not because you slept well, you didn't, but because something inside you hums with anticipation. You bathe, or at least you rinse. Maybe with water you've slightly warmed by leaving it near the hearth overnight. You scrub behind your ears and under your nails and comb your hair with more intention than usual. You even reach for that garland you've been saving. Dried flowers woven into a humble circle, slightly faded, but still fragrant. Out in the village square, change is visible. Flags are raised. Wooden benches are dragged into place. Bread ovens are fired up, and someone has already burned the first batch of oatcakes in excitement. The air smells like rosemary, spilled ale, smoke, and the faintest hope that life doesn't always have to be so grim. You're not the only one excited. Everyone's wearing their best, though best in this case means cleanest or least torn. Linen shifts with hastily mended sleeves. Wool tunics with fresh patches sewn on the inside where no one will notice. The girls wear ribbons in their braids. The boys try not to look too excited. Chaperones watch from the periphery, pretending to knit or pray while keeping a hawk eye on any budding romance. And there they are. You're maybe someone. The person you've been thinking about since that day by the well, when your hands almost brushed near the bucket. They're wearing a tunic that actually fits, and a look that says, "I'm pretending I don't see you, but I really do." You pretend not to notice, but you do. Feast days always begin with church. Everyone piles in, sleepy-eyed but dressed up. There's incense, hymns, and a sermon that tries to remind everyone that this is still, technically, a religious event. But once the final Amen echoes through the chapel and the bells ring out over the rooftops, the real celebration begins. First, food. People who usually eat barley mash and dreams now get roasted meat, cheese, early apples, sweet cakes, and weak beer that still tastes like heaven. You sit on long benches next to people you normally only nod at in the fields. It's loud, it's chaotic, and it's glorious. Second, dancing. This is where things get interesting. The dances are simple, designed for maximum participation and minimum scandal. Circles, lines, partner changes every few steps, so no one can linger too long with someone they shouldn't. But even so, the opportunities are golden. One brush of the hand, one look across the spinning crowd, one moment where your fingers graze and linger, just long enough. You catch their eye. They smile. It's not much, but in a world where emotions are hidden beneath wool and expectation, it's enough to make your heart trip over itself. Later come the games. Sack races, egg tosses, tug of war with a rope that's definitely seen better centuries. There's even a contest to see who can guess the number of turnips in a barrel. Everyone knows Agnes rigged it again, but no one minds. You and your person laugh together when someone falls face first into the mud. It's unspoken, but you both know what you're really doing. Finding excuses to stay near each other. And then comes the storytelling. Elders gather by the fire to spin tales of saints, ghosts, impossible love, and people who dared to kiss before marriage and were struck down by metaphorical lightning. Or more likely, a strongly worded letter from the bishop. Everyone listens, and in the shadows of the crowd, hands sometimes find other hands. Eyes meet and quickly dart away. There's magic in the air. You walk, not far, just around the edge of the square. A chaperone gives you the side eye, but decides you're within acceptable bounds. You talk about the festival, about the way the bread came out too dense, about the child who tried to joust a goose. You don't say what you're really thinking, but you both know. In some villages, there are actual matchmaking rituals, a mock drawing of names to assign courtship partners for the season. It's supposed to be symbolic, but everyone takes it very seriously. If your names are paired intentionally or by fate, you're almost guaranteed to be the subject of gossip for weeks. And in medieval Europe, gossip is practically legal documentation. As the sun dips below the trees, torches are lit, and music slows. People drift home, full and flushed. But the real treasure is what you carry in your memory. A shared dance, a shared glance, a moment where it almost felt like the world was just you two, and a slightly burned oatcake between you. Back at home, you peel off your garland and tuck it beside your bed. It's just dried flowers. But tonight, it feels like a promise. A symbol that in a life full of labor and mud, something tender still blooms. Maybe nothing more will come of it. Maybe everything will. But for now, you sleep with a full belly, sore feet, and the thrilling knowledge that you were seen, chosen, and, just for a day, loved. So now you've danced, you've feasted, you've exchanged enough meaningful glances to make a goose blush. But here's the rub. Unless you plan to marry them tomorrow, your courtship still has to follow the rules. And in the Middle Ages, oh boy, there are rules. Elaborate, contradictory, often completely unspoken, and usually enforced by someone with a very large rosary and a very low tolerance for nonsense. Welcome to the confounding world of courtly love. a romantic code invented by bored nobles, enforced by even more bored poets, and carried on by everyone too terrified to say, "I like you," without adding 6 layers of metaphor and religious guilt. It starts with admiration from afar, not across the room, across the social hierarchy. The whole idea of courtly love centers around falling for someone who is absolutely unattainable. Ideally, they're married, powerful, and completely uninterested. Bonus points if they live in a tower or have a husband who owns several battle axes. So why pursue them? Because, according to medieval logic, love that can never be fulfilled is the most noble kind of love. Makes no sense to us modern folk, but to a 12th century troubadour, it was pure poetry. Loving from a distance meant you were virtuous. Suffering in silence meant your soul was refining itself. It's the emotional equivalent of a medieval juice cleanse. Let's say you're a knight. You've seen the lady of the castle drop her handkerchief during falcon training. You pick it up, breathe dramatically into it, and immediately compose 3 verses of a poem that starts with, "Alas." Do you talk to her? No. That would ruin it. You send her gifts, a glove, a carved trinket, a pine cone that reminds you of her eyebrows. She acknowledges it with a smile. You write 18 more poems. That's the game. The idea is that love ennobles the lover. It makes you stronger, braver, more chivalrous. A knight in love fights better. He's cleaner. He's more poetic. He even starts bathing voluntarily, which frankly might be the strongest argument for romance in the entire Middle Ages. But don't be fooled. These rules don't apply to peasants, not officially at least. Courtly love is for the noble class. Peasants were busy actually trying to get married and survive. Still, the idea trickled down. Even among commoners, people started copying the gestures, singing under windows, giving tokens, sighing dramatically over bread kneading. Historians still argue whether these behaviors reflected actual emotion or just a desire to emulate the upper class with fewer feathers. The literature of courtly love explodes in this period. Stories of Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, and a dozen other doomed lovers. Songs performed in courts, full of longing and sorrow, and bizarre metaphors like "her cheeks shine brighter than goose fat at Michaelmas." You know, romantic stuff. And then there are the rules. Yes, capital R rules. In fact, an entire guidebook existed, supposedly penned by Andreas Capellanus, called The Art of Courtly Love. It laid out, in excruciating detail, things like how to flirt, how to write love letters, and why true love cannot exist in marriage. Yes, you read that right. Courtly love must remain unconsummated. If you actually get together, you've ruined everything. It's like the medieval version of Will They Won't They, but with more chastity belts and fewer season finales. In noble courts, this idea becomes a sort of performance. People gather to debate hypothetical romantic problems. What if a lady loves a knight who is loyal to her enemy? They ask, sipping diluted wine and trying not to fall asleep. These debates were sometimes moderated by actual queens, who delivered verdicts on matters of the heart like judges at a romantic spelling bee. And while this all sounds a bit ridiculous now, it had a real impact. It shaped how people thought about relationships, idealizing longing, romantic suffering, and the act of loving without expectation of reward. It elevated the idea that love was a moral force, one that could make you better simply by existing. But of course, real life isn't poetry. While noble lovers sighed under balconies, marriages were still being arranged in back rooms with spreadsheets made of goat parchment. Parents didn't care about your size. They cared about your land, your titles, your ability to not embarrass the family during harvest season. Still, courtly love offered an outlet, a fantasy, a space where you could imagine romance beyond politics, duty, and childbearing expectations. Even if you knew it was nonsense, it gave shape to feelings you weren't allowed to express otherwise. And sometimes, just sometimes, those feelings bled into the real world. A noblewoman might actually favor a knight. A servant girl might dream about the minstrel who writes songs about her braid. A page boy might sneak a flower to the stable hand and pretend it's from the wind. These things happened, quietly, carefully, often without happy endings. But they happened. Of course, all this noble pining didn't mean people weren't, shall we say, getting together outside of marriage. They were, constantly. But that's not courtly love. That's just life, inconveniently policed by the church. The romantic ideal remained separate, elevated. It wasn't about bodies. It was about souls. The kind of love that makes you write poems in mud with a stick while crying into your porridge. So here you are, a humble villager, watching the Lord's daughter receive a ribbon from a knight in gleaming armor. You roll your eyes. Then you turn and catch your crush across the courtyard, carrying 2 buckets of water and humming a tune you hummed yesterday. You smile. Because maybe you don't have a troubadour, or a banner, or a poem written in gooseblood on parchment made from lambskin. But you do have something better. Someone who knows your laugh, has seen your hair in the morning, and still smiles when you walk by. In the end, courtly love was a fantasy. And like most fantasies, it says more about what people wanted than how things really were. But even in all its absurdity, it gave people something to hope for, something to feel, a way to turn the messy chaos of affection into something that, for just a moment, felt almost holy, even if it was just about a pine cone that reminded someone of your eyebrows. Let's say things are going well, really well. You've made eye contact at the well at least 3 times without either of you falling in. You danced a whole turn at the feast day without tripping, and, be still your heart, they laughed at your joke about moldy cheese. In medieval terms, you're practically engaged. But here's the twist. You don't just get engaged. Not without a conversation that has absolutely nothing to do with love, butterflies, or romantic sunsets. Instead, it's time to talk. Dowries. Yes, welcome to the medieval pre-marriage negotiation table, where romance is converted into livestock units, and the future of your love story depends on how many chickens someone's aunt is willing to throw in. In medieval Europe, marriage is as much about property as it is about people. If you're a woman, your family has to provide a dowry, a bundle of goods, land, or hard coin that goes with you into the marriage. It's not a gift. It's leverage. It says, my daughter might be missing 3 molars, but look at these 2 goats and half a field. If you're a man, your family needs to match that gesture with the douarium, a promise of support, and usually a roof that doesn't actively leak. In wealthier circles, this gets complicated. Lands are swapped. Inheritance rights are negotiated. Entire villages might change hands. Historians still debate whether some of these deals were marriage contracts or minor real estate heists. Among peasants, the negotiations are simpler, but just as important. Maybe it's a cow. Maybe it's 2 goats and a decent cooking pot. Or maybe, if times are hard, it's just a promise of shared labor and one reasonably intact spinning wheel. But even then, people get emotional. Because this isn't just economics, it's also identity. Your dowry reflects your value in the community. A generous one suggests prosperity. A meager one means whispers. She only brought 1 chicken, they say. sipping from chipped mugs at the tavern, and it's missing a leg. Ouch! Families often bring in mediators, usually someone who once helped settle a dispute over cheese storage and now considers themselves an expert on romantic transactions. These mediators weigh in on everything: how old the goat is, whether the tools included are rusted, if the hovel offered in the groom's family has at least one corner that doesn't smell like mildew. It's not just marriage, it's the biggest trade deal of your life. Now, let's imagine you're lucky. The families agree, hands are shaken, Ale is drunk, someone sings a terrible song. You and your beloved are now betrothed. But you're not officially married. Not yet. First, there's an entire social performance to get through. Everyone needs to know. Publicly. Enter the banns. These are formal announcements read aloud in church for 3 consecutive Sundays. They sound innocent, but they're essentially medieval background checks. Is there any lawful reason these two should not be wed? The priest asks, squinting at the crowd. And everyone holds their breath, waiting to see if someone's going to blurt out, "Yes, she was promised to a thatcher in the next village," or "He once tried to marry a sheep." In theory, the bans protect against bigamy, incest, and marriages made under duress. In practice, they also serve as village entertainment. People whisper. They speculate. They invent entire backstories about why you smiled at Thomas the Miller last year, even though you clearly had eyes for someone else. It's small-town social theater, and it's merciless. Sometimes things fall apart at this stage. A better offer comes along. Someone confesses a previous engagement. A dowry item turns out to have been stolen from a neighbor. And just like that, the match is off. No hard feelings, except for everyone involved. Especially the chicken, who now has no idea whose yard it belongs in. But if everything goes according to plan, the preparations begin. Wedding clothes are mended. A cousin starts practicing a dance. The priest starts polishing his most dramatic blessing voice. And you? Well, you start preparing emotionally for what comes next. Because here's the truth. Love may have started this, but marriage is about survival. You're not just choosing a person. You're choosing a work partner, a child-raising ally, and someone who will ideally not give you plague through poor spoon hygiene. You're binding your futures together in a way that has legal, spiritual, and agricultural consequences. And sometimes, just sometimes, love matches happen. A boy and a girl, or a girl and a girl, or 2 sheepishly blushing boys, depending on which cloistered corridor you're eavesdropping in, fall for each other, and the families happen to approve, and the dowries align, and the heavens don't throw a thunderstorm in protest. When that happens, it's magic, but most of the time, it's about timing, goats, and availability. And let's not forget the deeply medieval problem of surprise cousins. More than one marriage has been postponed due to a last-minute discovery of shared great-grandparents. We're how many steps from being related, you ask, horrified. Only 2, the priest says, which is practically strangers by medieval standards. And sometimes the conversation gets especially awkward when the animals are more attractive than the people involved. She's got a fine plot of barley, they say, and an even finer pig. You glance at the pig. It's not a compliment you can really argue with, but you try to remember why you're here. Not for the goats, not for the land, for them. The person who danced with you under the spring moonlight, who once shared a slightly moldy apple with you in silence, who wrote, "Your laugh is like a butter churn at dawn," in a letter they clearly paid someone else to write. And as the preparations begin, Lists of food, borrowed cloaks, prayers said for fertility, and a rat-free bed. You let yourself believe that maybe, just maybe, this medieval love story might actually have a happy ending. Even if it starts with a chicken named Margaret and a cooking pot with only 3 legs. So you've made it this far. The families have nodded in agreement. The dowries have been inspected. Yes, even the one-legged pot passed muster. And the banns have been read without interruption. You're nearly there, almost officially married, but not so fast. Because before the wedding can take place, there's one final group that needs to weigh in. No, not the gossipy neighbors, though they're already baking symbolic pastries and speculating on the color of your future child's hair. No, we're talking about the real power players in medieval matchmaking. The clergy. In the Middle Ages, love is fleeting, but marriage is a sacrament, a divine contract, a spiritual alliance that will bind you in this life and, depending on how you behave, maybe even the next. So naturally, the church wants a say, a very loud, very detailed say. Enter the parish priest, the quiet matchmaking juggernaut of medieval romance. He knows your family, your habits, and how often you've been in confession lately. He also knows if your intended once stole turnips from the abbey garden, which, while not exactly a deal-breaker, is something he'll bring up with a raised eyebrow. First, he'll want to know, are you marrying for love, or for land, for virtue, or to spite someone? Is this union honest, holy, and consensual? Or was it cooked up after 3 too many tankards of cider and a dare involving a goose? You can lie, of course, people do, but be warned. Priests can sniff out hesitation like bloodhounds trained on guilt and mildew. If he approves, he may offer guidance, well-meaning, if occasionally unsettling. Advice like, keep your spouse warm in winter and never argue near livestock, or pray daily and avoid temptations of the devil, especially in haylofts. You nod solemnly, pretending this advice is brand new information. In some cases, the priest plays a more active role, especially if the bride and groom are especially young, poor, or painfully shy. Priests have been known to write marriage agreements, deliver messages, and in extreme situations, even suggest partners. You know, he'll say after confession, Edric the Cooper is a devout man, and owns a very fine bench. Now, it wasn't all holiness and hymns. The church had its own politics. A marriage between 2 influential families might be fast-tracked. A union that threatened land claims? Delayed indefinitely. And if you or your betrothed had ever taken a vow of chastity, joined a religious order, or even flirted with someone under holy protection, things got messy. Canon law, messy. Still, once the priest gives his nod, the gears of marriage begin turning quickly. But here's the thing. Some couples can't wait that long. Enter the world of secret marriages. Sometimes it's young love. Sometimes it's desperation. Sometimes you just really don't want to wait until after Lent. Whatever the reason, couples occasionally married outside the church's official channels. These clandestine marriages were technically valid, as long as there was mutual consent, but they were frowned upon, heavily. Picture this. It's twilight. You're in the pigsty, awkwardly dressed in your second-best tunic because the good one's drying by the fire. A friend holds a torch. Another awkwardly hums a hymn. You clasp hands, say your vows out loud to each other, and that's it. You're married. Sort of. Probably. Unless someone tells the bishop. Clandestine marriages weren't always romantic. They were often practical. Ways to bypass disapproving families, strict social rules, or inconvenient betrothals to people you barely knew. But they were risky. If discovered, they could be annulled. Worse, if someone later denied it ever happened, you could be accused of fornication or fraud. The church eventually tried to crack down. By the 13th century, canon law required marriages to be witnessed and recorded publicly. Still, secret weddings persisted, especially among those who didn't have time for official channels: soldiers, travelers, widows, or anyone trying to outmaneuver a particularly judgmental uncle. Meanwhile, back in the respectable world, you and your betrothed are now officially announced, which means everyone has an opinion. The neighbors weigh in on your compatibility. The baker comments on your mutual bread preferences. Your great aunt, who once chased off a suitor with a wooden ladle, insists your future spouse has the brow of a fence thief. She's not wrong, but that's beside the point. There's also the gift giving. Families exchange small presents: clothing, tools, maybe even a shared heirloom that hasn't fallen into the hearth yet. These tokens are symbolic, but also practical. Here's a comb, your future mother-in-law says. Try not to look like a frightened sheep on your wedding day. The priest may ask you to undergo premarital instruction. You learn how to be good spouses, how to care for each other, what Scripture says about marriage, and what not to do with bread dough if you're angry. It's a mixture of morality and mildly awkward life coaching. And then, finally, there's the blessing of the bed. Yes, you heard that right. In some communities, especially among the wealthier classes, the wedding bed itself was blessed. Sometimes publicly. Priests would sprinkle holy water, say prayers for fertility and harmony, and hope no one noticed the straw poking through the mattress. Occasionally, guests would escort the couple to the bedchamber in a weirdly ceremonial procession, like a parade but with more nervous giggling. It's supposed to be holy. It's also terrifying. Imagine being followed by your great aunt, a priest, and a pair of goats, all while someone chants, "May your union be fruitful." No pressure. Yet, through all the rules and rituals, the judgments and the jugs of ale, the awkward eye contact, and the loud blessings, one truth emerges. People still find each other. They fall in love between hay bales and hymnals. They whisper vows under fig trees and in forgotten corners of the village. They risk social scandal, family feuds, and ecclesiastical disapproval, because somehow, despite it all, they believe that being together is worth it. So when you and your betrothed lock eyes across the church aisle, hands fidgeting nervously at your sides, you know something sacred is happening. Not just in the eyes of God or the ledger of the priest, but in the hearts of two very human, very hopeful people. At last, the day everyone's been whispering about behind baskets of onions and over barrels of weak ale has arrived. Your wedding day. The culmination of weeks, maybe months, of sidelong glances, sheepish conversations, dowry bartering, and the deeply medieval experience of watching your relationship progress under the supervision of a chaperone, 2 hens, and your grandmother's suspicious stare. But if you're imagining a romantic ceremony in a candlelit chapel with flower petals scattered underfoot and an ethereal choir singing in harmony, think again. This is medieval Europe. Your wedding might take place beside the pigsty. Your bouquet could be a handful of wild herbs to ward off evil spirits. And your aisle? More likely a muddy trail lined with curious neighbors and at least one goat chewing someone's sleeve. Weddings in the Middle Ages were less about personal expression and more about public confirmation. That's why the ceremony almost always happened outside the church. right at the front doors. This was no private affair. The entire village was welcome. In fact, encouraged. Marriage was a public contract, a union that impacted the entire community. Who you married determined alliances, land holdings, labor arrangements, and how many pigs your cousin's family might owe you next harvest. You stand at the threshold of the church in your best tunic, which means the one with the least visible patches, and freshly washed hair, still slightly damp and smelling vaguely of rosemary and rainwater. Your betrothed stands beside you, equally nervous, equally scrubbed. Around you, villagers gather, shifting from foot to foot, whispering, nudging, already placing bets on whether your first child will arrive a little early. The priest begins the ceremony. He holds a book of Latin prayers and mutters through the opening blessings while trying to ignore the geese honking behind the back row. You exchange vows, repeating the words after him in the local vernacular. Promises of fidelity, of support, of joining your fortunes, your faults, and your future foot fungus, till death or dysentery do you part. Then a ring if you're wealthy, or perhaps a woven ribbon, a carved token, or even a symbolic coin passed from hand to hand. A visible reminder that you're not just romantically entangled, you are legally, spiritually, and economically bound. The priest offers a blessing, perhaps flinging a bit more holy water than necessary. It drips down your nose and into your eyes. You blink, smile, and wonder briefly whether all weddings feel this soggy. And now, you're married, but not done. Because now it's time for the wedding procession. In some villages, this means walking through town hand in hand, followed by cheering guests, clanging pots, and someone loudly singing a local fertility ballad that definitely wasn't approved by the church. You might be showered in grain, pelted with herbs, or accompanied by a group of small children waving ribbons and asking extremely personal questions about where babies come from. In noble households, the celebration grows grander. Trumpets blare, banners fly. Entire town squares are decorated in your family colors. You might ride a horse draped in linen while a herald proclaims your names and virtues, true or imagined, to everyone within shouting distance. But if you're a peasant, the procession is mostly you, your new spouse, and a parade of relatives trying not to slip in the mud. And then comes the feast. Among nobility, it's a banquet. Roasted boars, honeyed fruits, pies filled with songbirds, and goblets of spiced wine. Minstrels strum lutes, dancers twirl in embroidered silks, and someone inevitably composes a poem comparing your love to a battlefield or a particularly well-tuned crossbow. For common folk, the feast is humbler, but no less joyful. Tables are made from old doors propped on barrels. Everyone brings something to share: smoked fish, sourdough rounds, boiled root vegetables, and ale by the bucket. Someone contributes a cheese wheel so aged it might qualify for sainthood. And, of course, there's music. Not the elegant harp songs of the court, but drums, flutes, and homemade instruments, all played slightly off-key and extremely enthusiastically. People eat, drink, and offer toasts, some heartfelt, some barely coherent. Your uncle stands up, sloshes his cup, and wishes you a long life, at least longer than your mother's first marriage. There's laughter, clapping, and a fair bit of shouting over whose turn it is to pass the mead. You sit beside your new spouse, both of you still processing what's happened. You're exhausted, full, and more than a little giddy. You trade smiles, hands brush, someone sees and winks. You pretend not to notice, but your cheeks flush anyway. Then come the gifts. Practical, often peculiar, a wooden spoon shaped like a duck, a small basket of eggs, only slightly cracked, a wool shawl, a wheel of butter, and a pile of dried lavender tied with string. One elderly aunt gifts you a loaf of bread with an entire poem carved into the crust. You nod graciously while mentally filing it under unlikely to eat, definitely going to keep. As the feast winds down, talk shifts to what everyone's really waiting for, the bedding ceremony. Now, depending on where you live, this could be symbolic or wildly intrusive. In some communities, the couple is quietly escorted to their new home while friends and family sing bawdy songs and throw herbs for luck. The door is closed. Privacy is granted. The marriage is sealed in silence. But in others, not so lucky. There are places where the crowd follows you to the bed. Not into it, thankfully, but close enough to make your ears burn. The priest might say one final blessing over the mattress. Relatives might carry you over the threshold, cheering, jeering, and offering advice you didn't ask for. Candles are lit, blankets fluffed. At least one person throws a boot for luck. And then, finally, the door is closed. You exhale. The room is quiet now. The fire glows low in the corner. The straw mattress crackles slightly as you sit side by side, still fully clothed, still slightly stunned. You glance at them. They glance at you. You both laugh, quietly, nervously, genuinely. And something settles between you. A kind of peace, a recognition. You've crossed a threshold together, not just physically, but symbolically. From two people hoping for love into something more grounded, partnership. You reach for their hand. It's warm, calloused, familiar. You think of all the moments that led here. Awkward greetings at the well, borrowed cloaks, secret smiles during market day. The wedding feast may have ended, but something else has begun. Tomorrow, there will be work, sore feet, mud, arguments about livestock, and yet, tonight, you share this bed, this breath, this beginning, and somehow, that's enough. Outside, the last of the guests stumble home, laughter echoing down the road. A breeze rustles the thatch, and inside, under a slightly itchy wool blanket and a roof that leaks only during serious rainstorms, two people start the quiet, imperfect, enduring business of building a life. It may not be a fairy tale, but it is a start. Morning arrives with no fanfare. There are no bells, no choirs, and certainly no breakfast in bed. Instead, the rooster starts yelling before dawn. Someone's child is already crying outside your window, and your first full day as a married person begins with the deeply unromantic realization that your new home smells faintly of cabbage and wet wool. You sit up in bed. Your back aches from the straw mattress. Your elbow has a mysterious scratch. You turn and look at your spouse, hair flattened on one side, snoring softly. It's not quite the glowing vision the poets promised, but oddly enough, it feels right. Then it begins. Your first real conversation as a married couple is interrupted by someone knocking on the door. Your cousin, delivering leftover oatcakes and already asking if you plan to name your first child after Great Uncle Bertram. You thank him politely and close the door with a sigh. Privacy, it turns out, is not a medieval luxury. Back in the square, the gossip mill is already spinning. The villagers have opinions, and they are ready to share them. "Did you see the way he smiled during the blessing?" one woman asks while churning butter. "Definitely already in love," her neighbor replies. Or gas. Could have been gas. The next few weeks are a blur of adjustment. You share everything now. A bed, a blanket, a wooden cup, and a future that depends heavily on the next harvest and whether the roof holds through the first rain. Romance, such as it is, now coexists with reality. You quickly learn each other's habits, the way they hum while milking the goat, the way you count your steps while walking uphill, the little quirks that make them human, lovable, annoying, real. And then, things change. Because no matter how sweet the courtship was, marriage isn't always a fairy tale. In fact, it rarely is. Arguments begin over things like bread crust, pig feeding schedules, or whether it's your turn to fetch water. The tension builds until someone slams a wooden ladle down and declares they're sleeping facing the wall tonight. Breakups in medieval times weren't simple. There was no divorce court for commoners, no annulment hotline. If things didn't work out, well, you had to get creative. There were cases, oh, so many cases, of petty acts of spousal rebellion, like hiding each other's shoes, or feeding the best scraps to the dog, or pretending not to hear when your spouse yells for help with the firewood. Some disputes escalate. He accuses her of laziness. She accuses him of having the personality of a moldy onion. Someone throws a spoon. The priest is called. And suddenly, your private quarrel becomes a public drama. In one documented case, a woman aired her grievances by writing a song about her husband's lackluster haystacking technique and performed it loudly at the village fair. The entire village joined in by the third verse. Petty? Absolutely. Effective? Also yes. In noble households, things are slightly more formal. Slightly. Marriages are political alliances, and unraveling them is delicate work. A noblewoman might write letters to the local bishop claiming neglect. A nobleman might hire scholars to prove she was distantly related to him in a forbidden way. One French count tried to annul his marriage by arguing his wife had once seen him naked before marriage, which apparently counted as pre-consummation. But for the average couple, ending things was more ambiguous. Separation happened, but it was messy. Some spouses quietly moved back with their parents. Others slept in separate corners of the house, divided by a symbolic wall of firewood and grudge. And a few just kept living together, mostly ignoring each other except when the cows escaped. Still, despite the drama, most marriages muddled through, because survival in medieval Europe was hard enough without trying to do it alone. Farming, cooking, washing, mending, hauling, parenting. These things were easier with a partner, even one who snored like a bear and constantly forgot to patch the roof. And then, as you go about your shared life, something happens. You begin to soften. You stop keeping score of whose turn it is to gather firewood. You notice they always save the last bite for you. They mend your tunic without being asked. You laugh together over a burnt pie crust and realize, somehow, you've built something real. Something stronger than fleeting affection. In a world where plague, famine, and accidental injury are part of daily life, partnership becomes profound. You might not always like each other. You'll fight. You'll groan. You'll wonder why you ever thought marrying someone who puts onions in everything was a good idea. But you also hold each other through fevers, carry each other's burdens, and remember each other's favorite saint days. Even when love fades, loyalty often remains. Of course, that's the good version. Sometimes things go very badly. Adultery, abandonment, even violence. And here's where the church reappears. Because if your marriage has truly broken down and you're desperate enough, you can try to get it annulled. But it won't be easy. You'll need witnesses, testimonies, sometimes actual trials. In one recorded case, a woman claimed her husband turned out to be a monk in disguise. In another, a man tried to annul his marriage by saying his wife grew a tail, which was later revealed to be a tumor. The court was not impressed, and yet, despite all the obstacles, all the disappointments, many couples stayed together, not because they had to, but because they chose to. Over time, companionship emerged from chaos, and even if romance faded, respect often grew in its place. There's a quiet kind of love that comes from knowing someone has seen you at your most exhausted and still brings you a cup of broth. That love doesn't get celebrated in songs. It doesn't involve secret letters or festivals. But in the Middle Ages, it's the kind that lasts. So, as you and your spouse stand shoulder to shoulder in the field, watching clouds gather and hoping it doesn't hail again, you realize that love, in this world, isn't a thunderclap. It's a slow, steady warmth, like coals under a hearth fire. Sometimes it flares, sometimes it smolders, but it's there, even if you're still mad about the burnt bread. Your first winter as a married couple arrives not with snowflakes and soft candlelight, but with freezing winds that slip through the cracks in your walls and a constant battle over who has to wake up first to stoke the fire. Gone are the days of feasts and flirting. Now it's you, your spouse, a pile of damp firewood, and the slowly dawning realization that medieval romance smells a lot like wet wool and fermented cabbage. The honeymoon is over. In fact, in the Middle Ages, the idea of a honeymoon is more metaphorical than literal. If you're lucky, someone gives you a small jug of mead as a wedding gift and tells you to drink it for a full moon cycle to promote fertility. That's it. That's the whole honeymoon. No travel, no instay, no bed strewn with flower petals. Just the faint taste of honeyed alcohol and the hope that your new mother-in-law doesn't stop by unannounced. By now, your shared routine has fully kicked in. You wake together, eat together, work together, sleep together, sometimes elbowing each other over the one warm spot in the straw mattress. You've settled into a rhythm that includes arguing over who forgot to latch the chicken coop and discovering, too late, that the oat sack has been nibbled through again by mice. And yet, in this shared hardship, something real begins to grow. You know each other now, their laugh, their grumbles, the way they mumble prayers when they think you're asleep. You know how to step around their bad knee when you dance, and how they prefer their bread crusts, slightly burned and thick enough to survive a siege. But marriage in the Middle Ages isn't just a cozy arrangement. It comes with its own pressures, especially when it comes to producing children, fast. In many communities, the expectation is clear. Marriage leads to babies, and sooner is better. You don't have the luxury of waiting to figure things out. The priest blessed the bed. The midwife is already watching you at village gatherings, and your neighbor has started leaving you fertility herbs with a knowing look. Parsley, fennel, and something that smells suspiciously like burned onion. If several months pass and there's no sign of pregnancy, whispers begin. Maybe the moon was wrong. Maybe the mead wasn't strong enough. Maybe he's been cursed by a scorned milkmaid. Historians note that women were usually blamed first when children didn't arrive. Though medical knowledge at the time was so limited, infertility could be diagnosed from just about anything. Bad dreams, cold feet, or forgetting to sprinkle salt at dinner. Still, if children do come, the dynamic shifts again. You're no longer just partners, you're parents. And in medieval Europe, parenthood is perilous. Childbirth is dangerous, infant mortality is high. Even a cold can turn fatal in a poorly insulated hut. There are no doctors, just midwives, village healers, and prayers. You grip each other's hands through pain and hope. And when the baby cries for the first time, loud, pink, alive, you both weep. That first year, you barely sleep. You take turns holding the child, soothing them, carrying them through colds, colic, and days where the fire won't light. Your spouse starts waking before you to check the chimney draft. You save them the last bit of broth, even though your own stomach growls. Love changes. It gets quieter, but it deepens. And yet, it's not always like this for everyone. Some couples drift. They fall into routines so rigid, they forget why they ever smiled at each other in the first place. Days become duty. Nights become silence. Affection becomes a memory. And in these moments, something dangerous creeps in. Infidelity. Yes, even in the Middle Ages, people strayed. With marriages often arranged more for property than passion, it's no surprise that wandering hearts were common. A field hand catches your eye. A merchant's wife flirts a little too boldly. A night of ale and poor judgment. It happens. A lot. And when it does, people talk. In small villages, secrets don't stay secret. A lingering glance at the wrong feast, a missed church service, or someone getting a bit too creative with love poetry scratched into the side of a barn. Before long, you're the subject of hushed conversations and subtle side-eyes during market day. The church, of course, condemns adultery. Passion outside of marriage is a sin, one with heavy consequences. Confession is required, sometimes penance. In more severe cases, a public punishment. There are stories of adulterers being marched through town in nothing but their shifts, or made to fast for weeks under watch. But more often than not, it's the social shame that hurts most. And interestingly, there are double standards. Noblemen with mistresses, fairly common, expected even. Noble women with lovers, dangerous. Common women caught in scandal might be cast out, forced into penance, or, if pregnant, sent away. For men, a wink and a joke. For women, exile. Yet even amid betrayal, some couples mend. A heartfelt confession, a gesture of trust, a shared hardship, illness, famine, war, can bring people back together. Because for all its failings, medieval marriage is resilient, built not on idealism, but on survival. And survival requires forgiveness. Still, others give up pretending. They live together, but apart. They raise children, tend animals, and nod politely during meals. Their love story ends not with fire, but with slow erosion. And no one speaks of it because what can be said? Life is hard. Not everyone gets a happy ending, but many do. The ones who grow together, who learn each other's rhythms, who share small joys, a good loaf, a sunny day, a child's first step, who argue but still warm each other's feet beneath the blankets when the frost rolls in. And sometimes, joy surprises them again. A second wind of affection, a joke that sparks laughter, a gentle hand on the shoulder when grief arrives. You look at them, older now, hair graying, eyes tired, but familiar, steady, kind, and you think, I'd choose them again. So yes, medieval marriage may begin with mud, goats, and a rushed blessing in front of a crowd. But where it goes from there, that part is still yours to write, even if the ink is smudged and the pages are a little torn. You've survived your first year of marriage, complete with sleeping in a shared bed that creaks like a haunted cart, navigating disputes over firewood stacking techniques, and quietly negotiating the delicate matter of who gets the slightly less moldy side of the cheese. You've settled into a rhythm. You've weathered a few storms. But there's one thing that continues to loom over your union like a damp wool cloak in July. Purity culture. That's right. Time to talk about virginity, bed sheets, and the medieval obsession with what happens or doesn't happen on the wedding night. In medieval Europe, especially among the noble and merchant classes, a bride's virginity was more than just a moral ideal. It was a political asset. It determined dowries, dictated inheritance, and could even be a matter of life or death, figuratively, and sometimes literally. For women, purity was a public currency. For men, well, let's just say the double standard was alive and unwell. Before the wedding, whispers fly. Has she kept herself chaste? Was she seen alone near the river with that Cooper's son? Did she walk back from the orchard looking too cheerful? Even if no one has proof, the rumors have weight. A bride suspected of impurity might face a reduced dowry or be married off in haste, or, if she's unlucky, branded a fallen woman, a label nearly impossible to shake. So, how do families prove virginity? That's where things get, frankly, absurd. In many households, the wedding night was followed by a public inspection of the bed sheets. Yes, you heard that right. After the couple consummated their marriage, the next morning, someone, often the bride's mother, a midwife, or a gossipy aunt, would examine the sheets for blood. If a stain was present, it was held up as proof that the bride was indeed pure. People cheered. Some even paraded the sheet through town like it was the Holy Grail. If there was no blood, well, explanations had to be made. She's delicate, someone might say. She bathed too often, which weakens the body. Or, she must have already been secretly married to the Archangel Gabriel. Creative excuses were essential because an unstained sheet could lead to accusations of fraud, or worse, annulment. The church, of course, was deeply involved. Priests preached endlessly about chastity, especially for women. Virgins were praised in sermons, compared to lilies and alabaster and other metaphors that absolutely no one who'd ever worked a farm could relate to. For men, the standard was looser. Premarital dalliances were sins, yes, but forgivable. For women, it was often seen as an indelible stain on character. This double standard led to 1,000 little rituals, tests, and tales designed to determine a woman's virtue. Some believed walking barefoot over blessed stones would reveal sin. Others swore that if a woman looked into a mirror on a full moon and saw a wolf's shadow, she was impure. Spoiler alert, this probably says more about the mirror's quality than her moral standing. And then there were the superstitious cures, tonics, and herbs meant to restore virginity. These included concoctions made from mugwort, ash bark, crushed beetles, and prayers whispered into dark corners. Quacks sold powders that supposedly produced fake blood for wedding sheets. Some women even pricked their own fingers during the wedding night to leave a spot, just in case. Because in a world where your entire reputation hinged on a piece of linen, you did what you had to. But not everyone played along. There were rebellious couples who laughed off the expectations, who quietly threw the wedding sheet into the fire and never spoke of it again. Who knew their marriage meant more than a stain or a sermon? Who believed, in defiance of everything, that love was stronger than proof? Still, the pressure persisted. Some communities took it even further. In certain noble courts, newlyweds were watched by bedding witnesses, servants or family members who escorted them to the bedchamber and remained nearby until the couple was under the covers. Privacy was a luxury. Sometimes a pair of shoes was left just outside the door. If they were still there come morning, all was well. If not, someone was going to get a knock. And if a marriage wasn't consummated at all, That was legal grounds for annulment. There are records of couples being interrogated by clergy, or even doctors, using medieval definitions of medicine, which is to say, lots of guesswork and garlic. Couples were asked detailed, humiliating questions. Sometimes they were told to try again, with guidance. One case from the 14th century records a bishop advising a couple that perhaps more prayer and more ale would do the trick. Of course, the obsession with virginity didn't stop at the wedding. Even long into marriage, women were still judged by their virtue, often defined as their modesty, obedience, and whether or not they ever made eye contact with a man while buying carrots. Widow? You'd better not remarry too quickly. Divorcee? Good luck. Accused adulteress? Expect a penance walk barefoot through town holding a candle while people yell. Men? If they strayed, there were consequences, especially if they embarrassed someone important. But more often, they got a stern lecture and maybe a suggestion to pray harder. Or marry a second wife with a bigger dowry. Still, not all was grim. There were couples who ignored the noise, who shut the door, blew out the candle, and simply existed together in peace, who never had their sheets inspected, never felt the need to prove anything, who trusted one another, who laughed in the dark and whispered jokes about the priest's sermons, who made love not out of duty or fear, but out of a bond deeper than rules and gossip. And over time, those couples became legends in their own quiet way. You'd hear old stories. Remember Edric and Muriel, married 50 years, never once cared what anyone thought. Their love didn't need to be proven. It just was. So maybe, on your first morning after the wedding, when someone knocks asking for the linen, you look at your spouse and decide to offer them a plate of oatcakes instead. Maybe you tell them the dog ran off with the sheet. Maybe you hang it outside with nothing on it at all and let them wonder. Because medieval love isn't about perfection. It's about persistence. And if your worth as a partner is ever reduced to whether or not a piece of cloth looks dramatic enough to please a village, you'll know, deep down, that the only real evidence of love is the way they held your hand when the roof started leaking, the way they saved the last plum, the way they whispered, "We've got this," even when nothing made sense. Not blood, not bed sheets, just trust. So, the wedding is behind you. The bed has been slept in, inspected, maybe blessed, or maybe you threw the sheet on the roof and let the chickens peck at it just to confuse everyone. Either way, you're now officially married, officially exhausted, and officially expected to behave like a pair of respectable adults. But what if you're not quite done flirting? Because believe it or not, even in a world where most people didn't bathe regularly and courtship began with livestock negotiations, the Middle Ages still had pickup lines. Yes, pickup lines. Sort of. Now, they didn't sound like what you'd hear at a modern bar. No one was saying, "Are you a candle? Because you light up this feast hall." Instead, they were subtler, stranger, and usually involved metaphors so layered you'd need a monk and a dictionary to decode them. Let's start with the courtly class, where romantic language was an art form. A nobleman wouldn't simply tell a lady she was beautiful. He might say, "Your eyes outshine the torchlit corridor of my soul." To which she might respond, "And your gaze burns hotter than St. Dunstan's forge." St. Dunstan being, of course, the patron saint of blacksmiths, and, oddly enough, people with very dramatic dating energy. Poets, minstrels, and troubadours made entire careers out of composing these elaborate compliments. A knight might write, "My heart is a falcon, circling the tower of your virtue, ever hunting for a perch." It sounds romantic, until you realize it's just a medieval way of saying, You seem emotionally unavailable, and I find that irresistible. Among the peasantry, things were a little more down to earth. Courtship language was direct, funny, and often involved food metaphors. You need my heart like rye dough, someone might say while literally baking bread. Or, your smile is finer than my grandmother's salted butter, which, if you've ever tried 14th century butter, was a high compliment indeed. Animals also featured heavily. A particularly charming shepherd might lean against a fence and say, "You're finer than my best ewe," which sounds bizarre, but was probably meant with the utmost sincerity. Historians still argue whether that's romantic or mildly alarming, but one thing's certain: in a world full of wool and hard labor, comparing someone to your prized livestock was basically saying, "I'd trade 3 turnips and a chicken for you," and that's love. And then there were the riddles. Oh yes, riddles were a whole genre of medieval flirtation. Some were clever, others were borderline obscene, and many sounded like they were written after drinking too much small beer. A suitor might ask, "I rise with warmth and fall with time, yet I am not the sun. I stand straight in the morning mist, but by night I'm undone. What am I?" You're supposed to giggle. The answer, of course, is a candle. Definitely a candle. Some riddles were more abstract, designed to test wit. Others were so wildly suggestive they'd make a monk blush. But the point was always the same: to spark conversation, to share a smile, to give someone an excuse to laugh and maybe lean a little closer at the market stall. And then there were the tokens, which often went hand in hand with flirtatious words. A suitor might hand you a braid of ribbon, a carved wooden ring, or a pressed flower. With it, they'd say something simple but meaningful. "Keep this, so I'm never far." Or, "It smells like thyme, but I swear it's for love." Some gifts were stranger. In parts of Scandinavia, it wasn't unheard of for someone to offer a small carved bone, usually from a favorite animal, as a token of affection. Romantic? Morbid? Maybe both. But it worked. A gift, no matter how odd, meant someone thought of you. In a world where time was measured in seasons and survival was the goal, being remembered was everything. Not all pickup attempts succeeded, of course. Sometimes you'd try a line like, "The light in your eyes could guide me home through fog," only to get a skeptical glance and a muttered, "Then maybe try opening them wider next time you walk into a fence." Medieval people, for all their formality, could be delightfully snarky. And then there were the public festivals, where pickup lines flowed as freely as the cider. During May Day, harvest dances, or saints' feast nights, the veil of propriety lifted just enough for flirtation to shine. You might lean across a bonfire and say, "If I were a bee, I'd lose my wings for a sip of your honey." And they might roll their eyes, but they'd also smile. Of course, some lines were strategic. A man might compliment a woman's stitching not because he cared about her embroidery, but because it gave him an excuse to sit closer. A woman might praise a man's oxen to hint she knew how to plow a field, metaphorically and otherwise. These weren't just compliments. They were proposals in disguise. And occasionally, people flirted by accident. A shared laugh at the well, a helping hand during hay gathering, a moment of eye contact across the tavern as someone's goat knocks over a stool. Suddenly, rumors spread. They were seen smiling at each other, twice. Congratulations, you're now unofficially courting. Not everyone had the confidence or the vocabulary for pickup lines. In those cases, friends stepped in. The medieval version of a wingman might say something subtle like, "You know, Maud likes the way you carry that shovel," or "That baker's apprentice asked me if your ankles were strong." In a world where marriages were built on practicality, ankle admiration was a legitimate entry point. Of course, some compliments went too far. Call someone buxom in public, and you might end up in the stocks for impropriety. Flirt with a noble's daughter, expect a strongly worded sermon, or a sword fight. But when it worked, when the words landed, when laughter floated between two people like spring air, it was magic. Because here's the secret: even amid rules, rituals, and rat-infested taverns, romance still found its way. Not through grand gestures, but through humor, through awkward compliments, through clumsy riddles, through someone handing you a slightly wilted flower and saying, "I saw this and thought it matched your eyes." Was it poetic? Rarely. Was it awkward? Often. Was it honest? Always. Because in a world where life was short, dangerous, and filled with chores, a shared joke and a quick smile might just be the most romantic thing of all. If you've ever been in love, real, hold your hand through the plague kind of love, you know that sometimes words aren't enough. In the Middle Ages, this was especially true. Not everyone could write poetry. Not everyone had a minstrel on retainer. And let's face it, saying, "Your hair reminds me of freshly threshed hay," doesn't always go over well. So when words fell short, medieval lovers turned to objects. Small, symbolic gifts that whispered affection in a language everyone understood, even if they couldn't read. These were the tokens of love, and though they came in many forms, they all carried the same message. I care. I remember. I'm yours. Let's start with the most common: rings. Rings weren't just for weddings. In fact, a simple ring could be given long before a priest got involved. If you were wealthy, it might be gold, set with a small gem or engraved with initials. If you were poor, it might be bone, bronze, or even carved wood. What mattered wasn't the material, it was the gesture. Wearing someone's ring was a public sign of commitment. It meant you were spoken for, and that somewhere out there, someone was thinking about you whenever they weren't ankle-deep in turnip stew. Then there were braids of hair. Yes, actual strands. Hair was considered intimate, part of you, but shareable. A lover might cut a lock from behind the ear, tie it with thread, and tuck it into a pouch. Some even stitched the braid into the lining of a sleeve, or placed it under their pillow at night. A few noble knights reportedly wore their lady's hair under their armor, believing it would bring protection, luck, or, at the very least, comfort during battle. Though honestly, nothing about battlefield hygiene makes that sound like a good idea. For those with a flair for the poetic, embroidered handkerchiefs were popular. A woman might stitch her initials, or better yet, a small emblem representing her name, onto a square of linen and give it to her beloved before he left for a journey. A heart, a bird, a sprig of rosemary, something she could hide in plain sight. He'd carry it in his tunic pocket, pressed over his chest, a little shield of memory. In the countryside, lovers got more creative. Nutshells carved with initials, smooth stones, painted or etched. A young man might give his sweetheart a button from his tunic, saying, "Here, so you'll remember what color I wore when I first saw you smile." Sometimes the gifts weren't pretty. They were strange, personal. A charm made from a fox's tooth, a bracelet woven from pig bristles. One surviving letter mentions a man who gave his beloved a perfectly round pebble which rolled from the river the day I kissed her cheek. Simple, sentimental, slightly soggy. There were also tokens of faithfulness. In some places, women gave their lovers a token to wear while they were away, a piece of cloth from her dress, or a scrap of ribbon tied around the wrist. It was meant to say, "Don't forget me, don't stray." And while not legally binding, these tokens were serious business. Breaking your vow while still wearing a lover's ribbon? Scandalous. A one-way ticket to a very long confession and some serious side-eyes from the village weaver. Occasionally, tokens were edible. A loaf of sweetened bread, baked with herbs meant to inspire passion, or just better breath. A small apple, carefully chosen and polished. Dried fruit, nuts, even small wheels of cheese. Because nothing says love in the Middle Ages like food that won't kill you immediately. But the most fascinating love token of all, the reliquary-style charm, a tiny container worn around the neck or wrist that held something private and precious. Maybe a snippet of hair, maybe a note, if you were lucky enough to be literate, maybe a scrap of cloth with a perfume only one person wore. These were the ultimate secret gestures. Not flashy, not public, but intensely personal. A physical manifestation of affection, small enough to hide, strong enough to endure. And it wasn't just the items, it was the presentation. To hand someone a ribbon during a feast? Bold. To tuck a carved ring into a basket of eggs and leave it on their doorstep? Mysterious. To hide a pressed flower in a hymn book and watch them find it halfway through Mass. Risky, but thrilling. Love tokens also traveled. A soldier might carry his wife's braid into battle. A young woman might keep her betrothed's kerchief beside her while she spun wool through the winter. Tokens endured separation. They told stories. They held hope. And in a world where communication was slow and unreliable, they mattered deeply. Sometimes a token came with a promise. I'll return before the leaves fall. If I survive the winter, I'll bring you a comb made of ivory. These promises didn't always come true, but even when they didn't, the token remained. A relic, a reminder, a story that never quite ended. Of course, not all tokens were given freely. Some were won in contests, dances, or public games. At festivals, it wasn't uncommon for a woman to offer a scarf to the man who performed best at wrestling or archery. The scarf might be worn proudly, knotted around the victor's arm, or hanging from his belt like a trophy. If he liked her back, he might offer something in return: a knife, a brooch, a handful of coins saved from market day. But love tokens could be taken too. In heartbreak, a gift might be returned or destroyed. There are stories of women burning letters, tearing ribbons, or throwing rings into wells when betrayed. One famous folk ballad tells of a jilted lover who buried every gift she'd received in the forest and planted rosemary on top, so the memory would live, even if the love did not. And yet, despite the risks, the uncertainty, the endless rules about propriety and reputation, people kept giving. Because in the absence of privacy, in a world of communal living and public ceremony, objects became language. A token wasn't just a thing. It was a conversation, a confession, a claim. It said, "This piece of me is now yours." Even centuries later, we still do it. Keep the concert ticket stub, the shirt left behind, the necklace that once sat in someone else's palm. We still look at objects and feel the weight of memory. The Middle Ages may be far behind us, but the instinct remains. We still seek something tangible to hold on to, something small enough to fit in a pocket, but large enough to carry a heart. So if one day, in your travels through time or dreams or thrift shops, you find a carved wooden ring with no name, a dried braid tied in silk, or a stone with initials etched by hand, hold it gently. Someone once loved someone, and this is how they said it. By now, you've survived the courtship, the feast, the wedding night, and the long winter of shared chores and shared blankets. You've whispered compliments, traded hand-carved tokens, and figured out whose turn it is to scrape ice off the water barrel each morning. But there's one more layer to medieval marriage we haven't quite unpacked, and it's the one that sticks with you not just through cold mornings and muddy boots, but across decades, through grief, sickness, joy, and silence. Let's talk about intimacy, but not the scandalous kind. We're talking about the quiet, unspoken tenderness that grows between two people living side by side for years, maybe decades. Because in the Middle Ages, longevity wasn't promised. If you made it to 40 together, people didn't ask about your secrets. They assumed divine intervention. And yet, despite the hardships, many couples did form lasting, resilient bonds. But they didn't always look the way we expect. No love sonnets, no Valentine's cards, no dramatic sunset kisses. Just two people learning how to keep living alongside each other without losing their minds. Let's start with daily rituals. Every couple developed them. Maybe you always leave a bit of your bread crust for them, because you know it's their favorite part. Maybe they always check your boots for spiders before you put them on. Maybe you've never once said, "I love you." But every time your spouse hears you sneeze, they appear with a cloth, a cup of broth, and a look that says, "Don't you dare die before we finish that roof." These small things mattered. In a world where written words were rare, acts of service were the love language of the day. Fixing a torn sleeve, stirring the pottage while your spouse rests, sitting in silence after a long day, shoulder to shoulder, watching the fire turn to embers. These were the moments where love breathed, not loud, but steady. There was also physical closeness, though not always in the way romance tales imagine. You share everything: sleep, space, warmth, breath. And sometimes that closeness is comforting. Sometimes it's just crowded. Your shared bed may be lumpy and drafty, but it's also the one place where you meet as equals, tired and tangled and human. Of course, medieval houses weren't exactly spacious. One-room cottages were common, so even if you wanted a little mystery, privacy was rare. Children, livestock, in-laws, and neighbors drifted in and out like smoke. You learned to whisper when needed, or to speak through glances. A hand on the shoulder, a look across the room, a tiny nod. Whole conversations built in silence. And there were surprises, because just when you thought you'd figured your spouse out, they'd do something unexpected. Fix your broken stool before you noticed. Walk 2 extra miles to bring back your favorite herbs. Try and fail to sing you a lullaby during a thunderstorm because you once mentioned storms made you nervous. Even if they weren't good with words, these actions were their version of poetry. It might not rhyme, but it meant something. As time passed, your world shifted. Children were born, grew, sometimes left or didn't. Parents aged. Friends disappeared. And through it all, your partner was still there, your greatest ally and your most familiar irritation. The person who knew how you liked your eggs, when you needed silence, and why you always walked the long way to the market. You didn't always agree. In fact, sometimes you fought like crows in a bell tower, but you stayed. You mended what frayed. You forgave. Not because you had to, but because it was better than starting over with someone who didn't know your laugh. And in moments of grief, they were your shelter. There's something profoundly intimate about mourning together. When a child is lost, when the crops fail, when illness arrives. In these moments, the strength of your bond is tested. You might not speak for hours, but their presence beside you, their breath, their warmth, their trembling hand in yours, says everything. These are the moments when marriage isn't about attraction. It's about companionship, the commitment to carry the weight of life together, to be two candles flickering in the same wind. Even aging was a shared journey. You watched each other change, a new crease, a slower walk, a laugh that now ends in a cough. You teased each other about gray hairs, about forgetting where you put the broom, about snoring louder than a blacksmith's bellows. And even in old age, that spark remained. You still saw the person you once danced with, once chased through the wheat fields, once waited for under the moon. Some couples even found themselves falling in love again, years after the wedding. It wasn't fireworks. It was the kind of love that arrived while washing each other's hands after a long day, or finishing each other's thoughts when the fire burned low. A love that grew not in bursts, but in roots. Deep, quiet, unshakable. Not everyone experienced this intimacy, of course. Some couples never connected. Others grew apart. Some lived together out of duty, not desire. And that's part of the story, too. Not every medieval marriage was a love story, but every one was a partnership of some kind, shaped by the relentless rhythm of survival. And even in loveless unions, there were sometimes glimmers, moments of kindness, of shared history, of understanding. A bowl of soup left waiting, a scarf mended in silence, a hand steady in yours as you climb the icy stairs. These moments are easy to miss. They don't make songs or tales, but in many ways, they were the truest expressions of love in a world where time was short and comfort rare. So when you imagine marriage in the Middle Ages, don't just picture the wedding. Picture the quiet, the loyalty, the patience. Picture two people growing old together, not because it was expected, but because they chose every day to stay. Not for the feasts, not for the rituals, but for the simple daily joy of still seeing each other across the fire and still saying, without needing to speak, "I'm here. I'm with you." Of course, not all medieval marriages played out like quiet, tender ballads whispered over candlelight. Some were stormy, complicated, or full of unexpected twists. Because while the church might have preached that marriage was sacred and eternal, real life had its own ideas. And those ideas often came crashing in through the kitchen door with mud on their boots and a bad attitude. Let's talk about the conflicts, because once the honeymoon phase, if you can even call 2 weeks of firewood gathering and goat feeding a honeymoon, faded, reality settled in, and with it, so did all the ordinary human frictions. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't immune to the classic struggles: jealousy, resentment, miscommunication, and, perhaps most medieval of all, disputes over who gets to use the one working bucket. Some couples argued about money, or the medieval version of it. Maybe one spouse sold a goose without asking, or spent too many coins at the fair on a lute that they absolutely could not play. Or maybe someone promised to help shear sheep, then mysteriously vanished to pray in the woods for 3 hours. Arguments followed, loud ones, often in front of witnesses who conveniently pretended to be busy churning butter while hanging on every word. Other conflicts ran deeper: infidelity, abuse, neglect. These were all present in medieval marriages, even if they were rarely discussed in polite company. When tensions escalated, some couples turned to their local priest or village elder for mediation. Others simply developed a household routine that involved as little speaking as possible and a lot of pointed sighing over soup. Then there were the marriages affected by distance. If your spouse was a soldier, a merchant, or part of a traveling trade, You might go months, sometimes years, without seeing them. Letters were rare and often unreliable, so you waited, kept their side of the bed empty, left a candle lit at night, wondered if they were safe, wondered if they still thought of you, wondered if they'd come back at all. And sometimes they didn't. Death could strike suddenly. War, illness, childbirth, accidents, or just a bad winter. A spouse might disappear without warning, never to be seen again. And in a world without reliable records, you were left in a limbo of grief and confusion. So what happened then? Let's say your spouse has been gone for years. There's been no word. You've asked around. You've waited. You've prayed. Eventually, the community might consider them dead. But remarrying wasn't always simple. You needed witnesses, clergy approval, proof, or at least a strong enough rumor, to say they weren't coming back, and if they did return, years later, sunburned and scruffy and full of stories about pirates and soup made of pine bark. Well, things got complicated. There's a recorded case from 15th century England where a man returned after a decade to find his wife married to another man, and with 3 children. The village council held a long debate before concluding, somewhat anticlimactically, that perhaps the first marriage was stronger, but the second one had better bread. Sometimes practicality won out. Of course, not all separations were accidental. Some spouses simply left, packed their things, such as they were, and walked away. Maybe they'd had enough. Maybe they fell in love with someone else. Maybe they heard of better prospects in the next town over and didn't stop walking. And if you were left behind, you had to make a choice: wait, mourn, or move on. Abandonment cases were tricky. The church frowned on them, but villages often took a more pragmatic view. If you could support yourself and your children, people would eventually stop judging, unless you remarried too quickly or too well. Then, of course, the whispers started. And sometimes couples just drifted. They stayed in the same house, slept in the same bed, even shared meals. But emotionally, they were miles apart. No abuse, no infidelity. Just a slow, silent unraveling. 1,000 little hurts that were never addressed. A growing distance that no amount of soup could bridge. Historians still argue whether emotional estrangement was recognized in medieval marriage, or if it was simply endured as part of life. The records focus on legal breaches, abandonment, adultery, violence. But between the lines, you find hints of quieter sadnesses. Wives who moved back in with parents for health. Husbands who worked in distant fields all day and came home only to sleep. Letters unsigned. Eyes that no longer met. Still, even in troubled marriages, there were moments of grace. A shared laugh over a spilled pot. A child's smile that brought both parents back to the same page, even if just for a heartbeat. A day when the bread rose just right and it felt, for a fleeting moment, like the world had forgiven you. And when things were truly broken, when the anger outweighed the tenderness, when the silence became a wall, there were rare cases of separation. The church didn't allow divorce as we know it, but it permitted separations from bed and board, meaning you were still married in the eyes of God, but no longer had to live together. You kept your vows, but not your proximity. These arrangements were usually approved only in extreme cases: abuse, desertion, or serious moral failure. And they required formal approval, witnesses, and often a significant social cost. For most people, though, the choice wasn't legal. It was personal. Quiet compromises. Living together but apart. Continuing for the sake of the children, the harvest, the roof overhead. And in some cases, that decision, however painful, was its own form of endurance, a quiet kind of heroism. Because in the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't a fantasy. It was work. It was compromise. It was learning, over and over again, how to share your life with another deeply flawed, deeply human soul. Some couples fought often, loved hard, and burned out fast. Others simmered like a slow stew, getting better with time. And some simply persisted, like a candle that never flickered much but never went out. So yes, medieval marriage could be turbulent. It could be frustrating, disappointing, even devastating. But even in those moments, especially in those moments, it revealed what love truly meant in a world without guarantees. Not passion, not perfection, but staying, even when it was hard. In a world where most marriages began with contracts, alliances, or the trading of 2 cows and a promise, you'd think there'd be no room for something as unruly as love. But love, as it turns out, doesn't care about dowries or feudal hierarchies, or whether your father signed an agreement over barley and inheritance lines. Love, messy, inconvenient, and usually badly timed, still managed to exist, sometimes quietly, sometimes in secret, and often it was completely forbidden. Let's talk about forbidden love in the Middle Ages. The yearning glances across feast tables, the whispered conversations behind church walls, and the slow-burning ache of hearts that dared to want what they could never lawfully have. For many people, especially women and nobles, love was not part of the marriage equation. You married who your family chose. Your future was decided based on land, titles, lineage, and family strategy. Love, if it happened at all, was considered a bonus. Most of the time, it wasn't even expected. And yet, it happened. A noblewoman might fall for the household steward who brought her letters. A peasant boy might catch feelings for the merchant's daughter whose hair glowed gold in the morning sun. 2 apprentices might meet during a Saint's Day market and share a smile so charged it could light a candle. They knew it was foolish, dangerous, even sinful, according to the church. But that didn't stop them. They found ways to say what they couldn't speak aloud. A flower left on a windowsill, a ribbon tied to a fence post, a note tucked beneath a loaf of bread. And for those who could read and write, a rare skill in itself, there were secret letters, folded and sealed, carried by trusted hands or hidden in plain sight. A simple phrase like, "The sun rose bright this morning," could mean, "I saw you and thought of you." A reference to St. Agnes might mean, "Meet me at the well." There were also songs, composed by troubadours and whispered in courtly halls, filled with metaphors so layered they could be explained 5 different ways, depending on who was listening. "My heart, a falcon, circles your tower of virtue" sounds like poetry, but in courtly circles it was a not-so-subtle way of declaring romantic intent. People knew, they always knew, and yet they pretended not to, because pretending was safer. In rural villages, love bloomed in quieter ways. At the river while washing clothes, during the harvest, while gathering apples, while mending nets or picking herbs. A laugh shared, a shoulder touched, the realization that someone else understood the rhythm of your day, the weight of your work, the dreams you couldn't speak aloud. These moments weren't grand. They were human, and they mattered. But forbidden love was always dangerous. If you were a married woman caught with a lover, the punishment could be severe. Public shaming, penance, or even physical punishment, depending on the local laws. Men, especially of lower status, risked fines, flogging, or worse. A nobleman's anger was not a gentle thing, nor was the church's judgment. Still, the risk didn't stop people. The heart, after all, has a terrible habit of caring more about proximity than prudence. Some couples found ways to see each other under the cloak of religious activity, meeting at pilgrimages, festivals, or during late-night prayers. Others arranged accidental encounters in the fields, or used communal gatherings as cover. A crowded feast hall could hide a dozen quiet exchanges between lovers who never once touched. And sometimes, those loves lasted a lifetime, even if they never lived together, never married, never shared a home. Two people, bound by longing and distance, who held each other in memory as tightly as any ring or vow could. But not all forbidden loves stayed secret. Some were discovered, and when they were, drama followed. There are records of nobles locking their wives in towers, of lovers being exiled from villages, of communities demanding public apologies, complete with candle-carrying processions and solemn declarations of repentance. One particularly dramatic case in France involved a woman who was forced to carry a broom through the town square while singing a hymn of chastity. She later composed a bawdy poem mocking the whole ordeal and secretly passed it to her lover. Love, it seems, also inspires very creative revenge. Occasionally, forbidden lovers chose to run away. They'd elope, often to towns where no one knew them, and present themselves as husband and wife. Some succeeded. They built new lives, kept their stories secret, and hoped the past never caught up. Others were less lucky, tracked down, dragged back, and forced to face the consequences. But for those few months or years of freedom, they lived fully, and they never forgot it. Even within marriages, forbidden love could blossom. Sometimes a husband or wife fell in love with someone else. Sometimes the flame faded in the marital bed, but sparked anew with a childhood friend, a fellow worker, a traveling performer. The guilt was real. The conflict, gut-wrenching. You were torn between duty and desire, between what you owed and what you wanted. And in a time when your reputation was everything, even unspoken affection could be risky. So, what did you do? Maybe you kept your distance. Maybe you poured your longing into prayers or confessions. Maybe you joined a convent or monastery just to escape. Or maybe, just maybe, you loved in silence. You watched from afar. You never touched, but your heart burned nonetheless. Because even when forbidden, love had power. It shaped songs, inspired rebellion, fueled poetry and prayer. It created legends, tales whispered long after the people in them were gone. They loved, though they could not be together. She waited for him until her hair turned white. He built her a garden and never told anyone why. And sometimes, just sometimes, forbidden love became forgiven love. Over time, circumstances changed. Spouses passed, marriages were annulled, and those once separated lovers found themselves free. They married late in life, started anew. Their hands wrinkled, their backs bent, but their eyes still bright, because they had loved each other through time, silence, and distance. So if you imagine the Middle Ages as loveless or rigid, look closer. Look at the carved initials in the old pews, the pressed flowers hidden in family Bibles, the songs passed down through generations, carrying verses no one dares translate. Look at the tales of saints and sinners, often woven with longing, regret, and secret joy. Even in a world ruled by law, custom, and fear, the human heart found a way. To feel to hope, to remember, to love, even when it wasn't allowed. Not all love stories in the Middle Ages were between a man and a woman, dressed in itchy wool and arranged by their parents before either of them had finished teething. No, beyond the well-trodden paths of dowries, contracts, and church-blessed unions, there were other kinds of relationships, softer ones, secret ones, braver ones. Relationships that didn't always fit the narrow definitions of marriage or morality. Let's talk about queer love in medieval times, a kind of love often whispered, hidden, or simply ignored by official records, but nonetheless real and deeply human. First, it's important to note that the language we use today, words like gay, lesbian, bisexual, non-binary, didn't exist in the medieval world. People didn't describe themselves that way. But feelings, affections, deep romantic or physical attraction to someone of the same gender, those absolutely did exist, and they show up in letters, poems, court records, religious writings, and, most tellingly, the blank spaces in between. Let's begin with monasteries and convents, where single-gender communities lived, prayed, and worked together, sometimes for decades. While these spaces were designed for religious devotion, they also became settings of intense emotional intimacy. Monks wrote letters to one another that spoke of spiritual longing, yes, but also personal affection, even passionate love. In one surviving letter from the 12th century, a monk confesses to another, "I am yours, more than I am my own. I pray with your name on my lips." That isn't casual clerical chit-chat. That's emotional thunder disguised as Latin. In convents, women shared long days and quiet nights, forming bonds that modern scholars are still debating. Were they friendships, soul-deep spiritual kinship, or romantic relationships, cloaked in the language of piety? Consider this. Some nuns called each other sponsa, or beloved, the same word used to describe Christ. Others exchanged embroidered gifts, pressed herbs between pages of psalters, or slept side by side in private cells. The truth? We may never know exactly what passed between them, but something tender clearly did. Outside the cloister, same-sex affection was riskier, but still real. In the towns and cities of medieval Europe, records emerge, usually because something went wrong. Men caught in physical relationships with other men were often punished severely. In places like Florence or London, homosexuality was considered a crime, and charges could include public penance, imprisonment, flogging, or even execution in extreme cases. The Church lumped a wide range of non-normative behaviors under the broad and ominous word sodomy, making no distinction between orientation, identity, or even consent. And yet, people still found one another. They found ways to communicate, through tokens, through glances, through carefully worded messages passed between friends. Some met at public baths. Yes, those existed in many cities, or at feast days, festivals, and pilgrimages. They might say, "I walk in the steps of Saint Sebastian," a coded reference to one of the few saints whose story had been subtly adopted by queer people, thanks to his semi-nude imagery in paintings, and his martyrdom by arrows, a visual metaphor that some came to associate with suppressed longing and suffering. There's also the case of the sworn brothers and sworn sisters, terms used to describe two men or two women who lived together, shared property, and were buried side by side. Some historians argue these were platonic partnerships. Others suggest they may have been romantic unions disguised as close friendship. In many cases, these relationships lasted longer than most traditional marriages. In literature, we also find clues. Medieval romances, often layered with metaphors, occasionally included affection between same-gender characters that defied the expected norms. There are tales of knights pledging eternal loyalty to one another, described in language so flowery and intense it would make a modern wedding vow look curt. These weren't always about chivalry. Sometimes you read between the lines and see longing. Even cross-dressing, which was often criminalized, had a place in these stories. Some women passed as men in order to live freely, travel, or even serve in armies, often escaping the confines of gender roles and sometimes falling in love along the way. There are accounts of women marrying women while one lived publicly as a man. When discovered, punishment followed. But what's astonishing is how many communities, neighbors, fellow workers looked the other way until they were forced not to. In a world so focused on survival, compassion quietly trumped doctrine more often than you'd expect. In Muslim Spain, in parts of Italy, and especially in Persian and Arabic poetry, same-sex attraction was more openly acknowledged in literature and art. Poets like Rumi and Hafez wrote verses that blurred the lines of gendered love. In Japan's Heian period, romantic and erotic relationships between Buddhist monks and their male acolytes were recorded, sometimes even praised for their spiritual intensity. These stories, though not European, show that the medieval world was far more diverse in its understanding of love than modern myths would have you believe. And yet, in most places, queer love had to remain silent. There was no space for public affection, no ceremony, no recognition. If two people of the same gender loved each other, they couldn't declare it openly. They couldn't walk hand in hand through the town square. They couldn't hope for a church wedding or legal inheritance. Their relationship had to exist in shadows, in stolen moments, in shared chores, in quiet devotion that nobody dared name. Still, they loved. They lived together in tiny cottages at the edge of the village. They tended each other's gardens. They cooked for one another. They sat by the fire and told stories. And when one died, the other mourned, deeply, fully, and sometimes refused to remarry. Their grief was no less real than any widow's, only quieter. So how do we remember these people? Often we don't. Their stories were erased, their letters burned, their names changed. The church made sure of that. But the love remained, buried in poems, scratched into the margins of prayer books, hidden in the footnotes of legal documents. We find them in shared headstones, in records of two women leaving property to each other, calling each other my most faithful companion, in monastery ledgers that note two monks buried side by side as they requested, because they did request it, because they loved each other, and even if the world refused to name their bond, they lived it anyway. So tonight, as you drift off, think of them, not as tragic figures, but as survivors, as lovers, as quiet rebels who claimed joy in a world that gave them no language for it. They didn't need permission. They needed each other. And they found each other across the centuries, across the silence. Love always finds a way, even when it's not supposed to. By now, you've waded through mud-slicked courtships, hay-filled wedding nights, awkward riddles disguised as compliments, and love that bloomed both within and far beyond the church's expectations. But what happens when the years stretch long? The children grow tall, and the fire doesn't burn quite as hot as it used to, at least not in the hearth, and certainly not between the sheets. Let's talk about love in old age. Medieval edition. Contrary to popular myth, not everyone in the Middle Ages dropped dead at 30. Sure, the average life expectancy was lower than today, but that's mostly because of infant mortality, childbirth dangers, and the occasional outbreak of something awful and bubonic. If you made it past childhood and avoided plague, famine, and freak farming accidents, you could live into your 50s, 60s, or even older. And if you were lucky or stubborn, you did it with a partner still by your side. What did marriage look like after 30 or 40 years of shared life? Well, let's be honest. It probably involved a lot less flirtation and a lot more complaining about joint pain. But it also meant something deeper, a kind of partnership forged through routine, hardship, survival, and countless meals of onion stew. By this stage, romance had shapeshifted. Gone were the secret tokens and dramatic declarations. What replaced them were small rituals. The way they stirred your porridge just right. The way you knew by the angle of their shoulders whether they'd had a good market day or a dreadful one. The way you handed them a mug of ale before they even asked. Love, now, was memory. It was built into the walls you repaired together, the quilts you patched, the apple tree you planted that now leaned sideways, like the two of you when your backs gave out. It was in the stories you told your grandchildren, sometimes twice, because your hearing wasn't what it used to be, and in the silence you could share without discomfort. There were benefits to growing old together in the Middle Ages. With youth behind you, the pressure to perform or impress faded. No more worrying about dowries, family politics, or whether your teeth were good enough to charm someone at the harvest dance. You could relax into each other, complain about the weather, gossip about the young folks, and, perhaps, fall in love all over again. Not with who your partner used to be, but with who they'd become. Of course, aging brought its own complications. Illness was common. Strength faded. Memory sometimes wandered. But these challenges often brought couples closer. One partner became caregiver, the other comforted. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't poetic, but it was love. Quiet, persistent, present. And let's not ignore the emotional weight of shared grief. By the time couples reached old age, they had likely lost people. Children, siblings, neighbors. The Black Death alone wiped out so many lives that entire communities disappeared overnight. But in the rubble of those losses, surviving spouses clung to each other like anchor stones. One letter from the late 14th century, written by a widow to her deceased husband's brother, reads, "He was my hearth. In his silence I heard comfort. In his footsteps I knew I was not alone." That's not infatuation. That's a life shared. Even the church acknowledged the uniqueness of elderly marriage. While youth was lauded for its potential to produce children, old age was respected for its wisdom. Older couples were seen as steadying forces in their communities. They became matchmakers, godparents, midwives, and mentors. Their union was less about reproduction and more about stability. Some even married late in life, particularly widows and widowers who sought companionship over property, while second marriages were sometimes frowned upon, especially for women. They happened often enough that entire prayer books included special blessings for those joined again in affection after sorrow. And let's not forget humor. Old age didn't mean the end of laughter. Jokes were made about creaky knees, forgetful husbands, and snoring that could wake the rooster. One medieval French folktale describes an elderly couple who invent a silent language just so they can continue bickering after they lose their hearing. Gesturing wildly across the table while everyone else in the village assumes they're madly in love. They are. But not every elderly marriage stayed golden. Some couples grew apart. Tolerance turned into resignation. The warmth faded, and they simply coexisted, like parallel paths never quite touching. Others found companionship in neighbors or friends, quietly shifting emotional energy to new relationships while keeping the appearance of a proper union. And in rare but real cases, some elderly people left. A man might wander off to live with a distant cousin. A woman might move into her daughter's home in another town. These separations weren't always hostile. Sometimes they were quiet understandings. We've shared enough. Now, we rest apart. Still, most stayed, not because they had to, but because after all the storms, the floods, the livestock misadventures, and the long winters, they had become each other's shelter. One leaned when the other steadied. One coughed, the other fetched time tea. One forgot, the other remembered. They became each other's memory keepers, walking archives of shared experience, living footnotes in one another's lives. And when one passed, the grief wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, daily, lingering. The remaining partner would continue tending the hearth, whispering comments aloud as if the other were still listening, saving the last piece of bread, folding blankets the way they'd been taught decades ago. They mourned in habits, in silence, in survival. Because love in old age wasn't about holding hands in fields of flowers. It was about knowing how to fix the gate with one nail and a prayer. It was about waiting until they sat down before starting dinner. It was about standing at the threshold of your final years and realizing that somehow, astonishingly, you made it through, together. After a life spent navigating the winding path of medieval love, through courtship customs, marriage contracts, tokens of affection, quiet rebellion, and companionship in old age, we reach the final stretch of the journey, widowhood. It's a chapter that came more often than not. Though it was wrapped in silence and black veils, it was just as full of meaning, memory, and emotion as anything that came before. Let's start with the numbers. In medieval Europe, widowhood was common, especially for women. It wasn't unusual for a woman to outlive her husband by 10 or 20 years. While the average lifespan was shorter than today, if someone survived the perils of childhood, childbirth, disease, and war, they might live into their 60s or 70s. And when one half of a couple passed, the other had to learn a new rhythm of life, alone. But widowhood wasn't simply about grief. In fact, for many women in the Middle Ages, it marked the first true moment of autonomy. Consider this. Before widowhood, a woman belonged to her father, then to her husband. She needed permission to marry, to travel, to make legal decisions. But a widow, especially one whose children were grown and whose husband had left her property, was, in many ways, a free agent. She could own land, run a business, take legal action, and, in some cases, even vote in town matters. For some, widowhood was a liberation. They dressed in black or gray, not just out of mourning, but to signal a new status. A widow could refuse suitors. She could manage a household without oversight. She could become the village's wise woman, or its quiet force of authority. In records from France, England, and Italy, we find widows acting as landlords, moneylenders, and even heads of guilds. They commissioned chapels. They made endowments. They held court in their own kitchens. But behind that independence was often deep, aching grief. Many widows spoke of their husbands as my life's shadow, the fire of my house, or the breath beside me. Their deaths left behind more than silence. They left absences that echoed in every task. Fetching water alone, sitting through Mass with an empty bench beside you, hearing a joke and turning instinctively to share it, only to remember there's no one there. Some widows chose to remarry, and while the church was often fine with this, especially for younger women, society had mixed feelings. A widow remarrying too soon might be accused of greed. A widow marrying for love, that was even more suspect. But still, they did it, often to a man of their choosing, sometimes for comfort, sometimes for company. Sometimes because, after years of being someone's wife, they simply wanted to be someone's beloved. Other widows never remarried. They kept their late husband's name, his walking stick, his favorite mug. They spoke to him while stirring soup or sitting in the garden. They said things like, "You'd laugh at how crooked the plow runs now," or "The pig's grown fat, just as you liked it." In many communities, widowhood also came with a new role. You became a keeper of memory, a storyteller, a midwife, a matchmaker. You knew how to fix a tunic, when to plant onions, how to prepare a fever tonic. Young people came to you with questions, or just to sit and listen. You weren't just the woman who lost her husband. You were the one who had lived. For men, widowhood looked a little different. A widower often remarried quickly, especially if there were children to raise or land to manage. Society expected it. The church encouraged it. But not all did. Some found themselves adrift. A man who had never learned to cook or sew now had to figure out daily survival. Some withdrew into work or faith. Some drank. Some simply aged, quietly and swiftly. And others, too, mourned deeply. There's a record of a man in 15th century England who placed his late wife's shoes beside the fire every night until he died, claiming her spirit liked to warm her toes there. Another carved her name into his wooden walking stick, saying, "She steadied me when she walked beside me. Now she steadies me still." Mourning customs varied by region. In some places, the widow had to wear black for a year. In others, she was expected to say daily prayers or donate to the poor. In wealthier households, there were death coins, mourning veils, and requiem masses. But for most people, grief lived not in ceremonies, but in the everyday habits suddenly emptied. And then there were those who grieved together. It wasn't unusual for two widows, sisters, neighbors, or longtime friends, to move in together for companionship and mutual aid. They shared bread, stories, prayers, chores. They kept one another company during winter nights. Some even built lives together as companions or household sisters. Whether these were platonic, romantic, or something else entirely, we often don't know, but we know they chose each other in a world that had not chosen them. Even the church, while strict on remarriage rules, acknowledged the special place of widows. They were often depicted in art as humble and wise, associated with saints like Elizabeth or the prophetess Anna. Widows had spiritual weight, proof that love and loss could lead to grace. In some towns, widows formed fellowship groups, helping each other, tending to funerals, feeding the poor. They weren't just lone figures with fading memories. They were active parts of their communities, anchors. And finally, there was legacy. Widows and widowers alike made sure their loved ones were remembered. They funded chapel candles, planted trees, engraved names into pews. One woman in Yorkshire left money in her will for bread to be given to the poor every year on her husband's birthday, so his name might pass between mouths still. Because for all the grief, widowhood in the Middle Ages was not just an end. It was a continuation. A chance to keep love alive, not through grand gestures, but through habit, memory, presence. Lighting a fire at dawn because he always rose early. Tending a rosebush she once called our stubborn beauty. Setting 2 bowls at the table, out of instinct. And maybe, at the very end, lying down and whispering into the silence, "I'll see you soon. Don't worry. I remember the way."